The royal archives of the Northern Pack Keep existed entirely below the frost line, buried deep within the bedrock of the ancient fortress. It was a cold stone, candlelit underground vault where the air always smelled of damp earth, aging parchment, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron bindings. It was the 10th year of King Darius's reign, and outside the thick masonry walls, a bitter frost-locked winter howled across the tundra, burying the upper courtyards in deep snow. Down here, however, the temperature remained a stagnant, bone-aching chill that seeped upward through the soles of Nellie Vance's thin leather shoes. She did not mind the cold. It was predictable. It was a physical absolute in a pack hierarchy defined by volatile moods and sudden violence. Nellie stood behind her scarred oak desk, her fingers methodically aligning a stack of requisition forms. She paused to adjust the heavy linen of her work garment, pulling the straps tight across her shoulders. The lavender-and-pine apron was a practical necessity, a thick barrier infused with dried lavender buds and freshly crushed pine needles that she had gathered from the outer courtyard. She had spent hours rubbing the raw herbs into the coarse fabric, ensuring the oils penetrated the weave to mask her own faint, anxious scent from the high-ranking wolves, who rarely ventured this deep into the keep. As a low-ranking, wolfless clerk, her primary survival strategy was strict invisibility. Tonight, with a surprise royal audit, rumored to strike the administrative wing at any moment, she needed that botanical shield more than ever. Instead of pacing the length of the vault or wringing her hands like the other servants upstairs, Nellie channeled her apprehension into her physical labor. She tapped the edges of the supplementary patrol records against the massive, leather-bound grain reserve ledger until their corners formed a perfect, seamless block of white parchment. Not because the archives demanded such flawless geometry, but because the physical act of imposing strict order upon chaos kept her own mind steady. In the far corner of the cavernous room, a grandfather clock ticked with a heavy, oppressive brass rhythm, but she refused to look at its pendulum. Measuring her mounting anxiety against the relentless march of metal gears felt like a surrender. Instead, she lowered her gaze to the single tallow candle burning on the corner of her desk. She watched the flame chew through the blackened wick, counting the steady, slow drips of hot yellow wax as they rolled down the side of the iron holder and pooled on the wood, one drop every 7 seconds. She focused entirely on the small, physical decay of the tallow, finding a strange, quiet comfort in its predictable melting. Every drop that hardened against the iron was another moment survived, another fraction of the night safely consumed by the dark. She pressed her palms flat against the cold wood of the desk, letting the scent of pine resin rise around her, and waited for the heavy tread of the auditors. The intrusion did not announce itself with formal knocks or the herald of royal guards. The heavy oak door at the top of the stone stairwell simply gave way, shoved inward with a force that sent a violent shudder through the masonry. A sudden, aggressive draft of freezing air swept down the spiraling steps, carrying the bitter metallic scent of ozone, fresh snow, and raw, unrestrained predatory tension. Down in the vault, the sudden atmospheric pressure shift caught the loose index sheets resting atop the massive supply book on Nellie's desk. The gust scattered a half-dozen pages across the uneven flagstones, their dry fluttering the only sound in the sudden terrifying vacuum of the room. Nellie did not flinch. She did not immediately drop to her knees to gather the fallen records. She merely stilled, keeping her posture rigid and her hands flat on the desk, her breath catching silently in her throat. Alpha King, Darius Vorn, stepped into the threshold of the lower archive. He did not stride into the room with the arrogance of a ruler inspecting his domain. He simply materialized, his massive physical presence bringing a suffocating density to the limited air. The entire underground hall seemed to physically orient toward him, the way iron filings blindly align toward a crushing lodestone. But the man standing at the base of the stairs was not acting like a triumphant conqueror. He was visibly, terribly unraveling. For 5 grueling months the king had not slept. The chronic, brutal insomnia had driven his wolf to the absolute edge of feral madness, terrifying his elite generals, and forcing the sovereign court to operate in a state of perpetual breathless caution. Now, leaning heavily against the stone archway, his broad shoulders were rigid with an exhausting, vibrating tension. His thick, fur-lined cloak was dusted with unmelted snow, and his dark eyes were deeply sunken, framed by the bruised, hollow exhaustion of a man being consumed alive by his own hyper-vigilance. His breathing was not the measured intake of a king, but the heavy, ragged pulls of a wounded beast attempting to draw enough oxygen to remain upright. He paused at the edge of the light, his knuckles turning white where he gripped the stone wall. He did not immediately demand the ledgers or issue a vocal command. Instead, his hollowed gaze snagged on the empty space directly in front of him. Nellie watched, perfectly motionless, as Darius's eyes began to track the microscopic movements of dust motes dancing in the ambient candlelight. He was trapped in a sensory prison, his sleep-deprived brain so painfully amplified that he could not filter out the meaningless drift of particulate matter in the cold air. He followed a single, illuminated speck of dust as it spiraled downward toward the floor, his entire massive frame locked in a state of tragic, involuntary observation. Only when the dust mote finally settled against the cold stone did Darius slowly close his eyes, executing the heavy, agonizing blink of a sovereign holding his fractured mind together by sheer willpower. When he opened them again, he stepped forward, his heavy boot coming down directly onto one of the scattered requisition sheets. The parchment crunched loudly beneath his heel. He stood amidst the fallen papers, radiating a cold, dangerous exhaustion, and finally looked directly at Nellie. He did not retreat into the corridor. Instead, Darius moved deeper into the dim, claustrophobic vault of the records room. Bypassing the comfortable reading armchairs near the hearth, he reached for a heavy, straight-backed wooden chair meant for junior clerks and dragged it across the uneven flagstones. The harsh scrape of timber against cold rock echoed sharply, but his expression remained entirely unreadable. He did not sit back against the rest, but perched on the very edge of the seat, planting his boots wide on the floor, his spine locked into a rigid, forward-leaning posture, treating the small, ink-stained desk as if it were a tactical war map spread across a battlefield tent. He rested his thick forearms on the scarred oak surface, driven by a feral exhaustion that had systematically stripped away his higher diplomatic conditioning over the last 5 months. His claws extended involuntarily. They dug shallow, pale grooves directly into the timber. The faint sound of splintering wood filled the space between them. Nellie Vance did not flinch, nor did she ask if he required a healer. She recognized the posture of an apex predator, anticipating an ambush from the shadows. Panic would only trigger his hunting instincts. Silence was the only acceptable response. "The Winter Grain Reserve Ledger," the Sovereign commanded. His voice was a low, gravel-heavy rasp entirely devoid of royal inflection or polite request. "Open it." She stepped backward, moving with deliberate, unthreatening slowness, and retrieved the massive, leather-bound book from its reinforced iron shelf. It was heavy enough to require both hands, smelling intensely of dry dust, old beeswax, and cured animal skin binding. She set it gently on the desk between them, ensuring the broad cover hid the freshly gouged claw marks in the wood. She unclasped the heavy brass lock. The thick parchment pages fell open to the current month. The interaction immediately became strictly transactional. They did not exchange pleasantries, nor did he offer any explanation for seeking refuge in the subterranean levels of his own fortress. They were simply two parts of a biological and administrative machine, forced into the same tight space. "Western storehouses," he ordered, his gaze dropping to the dense columns of black ink. "Page 42, the clerk answered softly. She dragged her index finger down the first column, keeping her breathing steady and measured. Her lavender-and-pine apron rustled faintly with the movement. Winter barley. 400 sacks, logged on the first moon by the quartermaster. Cross-reference the distribution to the outer patrols. She flipped back 3 pages, her movements fluid and efficient. 50 sacks dispatched to the Northern Ridge outpost, signed and sealed by the transport captain on the 3rd day. He leaned closer to the book. The sheer physical density of the massive man dwarfed the desk, his broad shoulders blocking the ambient light from the distant hearth. His eyes darted across the numerical arrays with manic intensity. Every muscle in his neck stood corded and taut beneath his collar. When he reached out to turn a page himself, his lack of fine motor control nearly tore the brittle parchment in half. Sensing the danger to the royal records, she smoothly intervened. She placed her left hand on the bottom corner of the page, turning it for him before his claws could catch the fragile edge. He did not object to the correction. He simply kept reading. They communicated solely through page numbers, yield deficits, and transport dates. It was an administration of survival. The rhythm of her voice reading the figures became the only anchor in the room. The heavy iron latch of the outer door clicked. In the suffocating quiet of the vault, the metallic sound was blindingly loud. The Alpha's shoulders twitched upward, a micro-reaction of pure combat readiness, but his eyes never left the logistical reports. He simply braced his weight harder against the floor, ready to launch himself over the desk if a tangible threat materialized. Silas Croft stepped through the narrow doorway. The chief archivist carried a small wooden tray bearing 2 fresh vials of iron gall ink and a bundle of trimmed goose quills. He stopped dead when he registered the terrifying figure occupying his junior clerk's desk. Silas did not gasp, nor did he drop to his knees in a frantic display of subservience. Surviving decades in the subterranean archives required a specific kind of practical stoicism. He approached with slow, measured steps, setting the tray down near the edge of the desk without letting the glass vials clink together. The older man did not speak. To break the silence of the vault while the king was deep in a manic audit would be a fatal miscalculation. Instead, Silas caught the younger woman's eye over the flickering glow of the tallow candle. He raised his ink-stained fingers, utilizing the silent hand gestures they had developed over years of managing the vast, echoing library. He tapped 2 fingers against his thumb, the archive sign for the outer guards. Then he slid a flat palm sideways across his chest, restless. Finally, he tapped his collarbone twice. Absence. The message was acutely clear. The border patrols and the upper military tiers were growing dangerously agitated by their ruler's prolonged disappearance from the High Court. A pack without its visible leader was a pack that would soon begin testing the boundaries of treason. Nellie gave a single, imperceptible nod. She understood the precarious geometry of the situation perfectly. If the sovereign remained buried down here in the dark, the political structure above might fracture under the weight of rumors. But if he was forced to return to the council room in this volatile, sleep-starved state, his feral wolf would undoubtedly perceive their agitation as a challenge and shed blood on the marble floor. Silas tapped the edge of the desk once with his knuckle, a standard sign of withdrawal, and backed away into the shadows. The iron door closed behind him with a soft, final thud that sealed them back into their isolated pocket of existence. The king had not looked up once during the entire visual exchange. He remained completely fixated on the numbers, though the tension in his jaw suggested he heard the archivist's every footstep. He simply pointed a sharp, keratin-hardened nail at a faded entry near the bottom margin. "The Eastern oat yield is short by 12 measures," he stated flatly, "and the transport seal is missing." She pulled the heavy ledger just a hair's breadth closer to the candlelight. She uncorked the fresh ink Silas had left, the sharp scent of iron and crushed galls mixing with the subtle, calming draft of lavender rising from her clothes. "Let me check the secondary manifest, Your Grace," she replied quietly, picking up her quill. "If it was diverted, the ink trail will prove it." The subterranean archive vault maintained a bitter chill, the cold stone floor radiating a frost that seeped entirely through the thin leather soles of Nellie's boots. Yet at her battered wooden workspace, a strange, insulated microclimate had formed around their quiet labor. The massive leather-bound expanse of the grain reserve ledger lay open between them, its yellowed parchment pages illuminated by the steady amber light of 3 thick tallow candles. Nellie kept her focus anchored firmly on the towering columns of administrative figures, her steel-tipped quill moving in a precise, measured cadence. Every time her ink-stained finger traced a critical discrepancy, a phantom shipment of oats, supposedly delivered to the eastern silos, or a delayed wagon of winter wheat that never officially arrived at the border forts, she tapped the falsified entry twice. She possessed an absolute, structural memory for the logistical architecture of the pack, smoothly cross-referencing the main ledger against a stack of mud-stained delivery manifests, sliding the documents across the desk with practiced efficiency. She did not explain the fraud. She did not offer unsolicited advice on how to punish the corrupt quartermasters. Darius Vorn would lean in, absorb the mathematical error, and release a short, sharp exhale through his nose, recognizing the treason hidden in plain sight. No other words were needed. Darius occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. The tense, oppressive atmosphere that had accompanied his sudden arrival gradually transformed into a predictable mechanical hum of shared labor. As the hours burned away, the ambient chill of the vault began to interact with the natural warmth of Nellie's body, slowly drawing out the herbal infusion woven deeply into her clothing. The heavy linen of her herb-infused garment acted as a quiet, continuous diffuser. The crisp, grounding scent of crushed pine needles mixed with the dry, medicinal calm of dried lavender buds. It did not smell like the heavy, cloying perfumes worn by the nobility in the upper levels of the keep. It smelled like damp earth, like winter survival, like an empty forest far away from the blood and volatile politics of the sovereign court. For 5 agonizing months, the Alpha King's breathing had been jagged, shallow, and perpetually primed for an ambush. He breathed like a man suffocating in open air. But as the audit stretched into its second unbroken hour, his respiratory pattern began to shift. A predator's brain instinctively seeks an anchor in the chaotic exhaustion of prolonged insomnia. The sovereign found his anchor in the sound of her administrative work, the steady scratch, dip, scratch of the steel-tipped quill on the rough parchment became a reliable metronome in the dead of the night. Each stroke of the metal nib was deliberate, unhurried, and entirely devoid of fear. Without realizing it, Darius began to synchronize his ragged intakes of air with her movements. He breathed in as she drew a long, horizontal line across a mismatched tally of rations. He exhaled slowly as she reached out to dip the nib back into the dark iron inkwell. The wild, feral edge of his wolf, which had been pacing endlessly against the bars of his ribcage, stopped its frantic circling to listen to the rhythm. The scratching quill proved that the room was safe. No one holding a pen that steadily could be hiding a blade. The physical toll of extreme hyper-vigilance does not vanish instantly, but it can be dismantled piece by piece. Nellie felt the atmospheric shift in the air pressure beside her before she actually saw it. The suffocating, ozone-heavy dominance that usually rolled off the king. A scent that made lesser wolves drop to their knees in submission began to thin, replaced by the smell of wood smoke and pure physical exhaustion. Out of the extreme corner of her vision, she observed the rigid, locked line of his jaw finally unclenching. The massive, muscle-corded shoulders, which had been held tightly near his ears in a permanent state of defensive readiness, dropped a fraction of an inch, then another. The heavy, snow-dampened fur of his dark winter cloak shifted against the wooden spindles of his chair, the friction sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet vault. He leaned slightly forward, resting his heavy forearms directly on the edge of the desk, bringing his face closer to the source of the calming scent. The lavender-and-pine apron was accomplishing what no royal physician's draught, no sleeping powder, and no magical sedative had managed to do in half a year. The sharp, clean pine cut directly through the paranoid fog of his exhaustion, grounding him in the present physical reality. Simultaneously, the soft lavender signaled to his severely overactive nervous system that there were no hidden enemies waiting in the dark corners of the archive. Here, there was only cold stone, the smell of drying ink, and a quiet woman who did not ask anything of him. Nellie kept writing. She did not freeze, did not gasp, and did not make the mistake of acknowledging the terrifying sovereign's slow collapse into physical safety. To acknowledge his vulnerability would be to instantly ruin it. She simply turned another thick, stiff page of the heavy registry, smoothing the edge down with the flat of her left palm. When she paused to let the fresh ink dry on a particularly dense paragraph of misallocated funds, Darius did not immediately demand the next sheet. Nellie risked a microscopic glance upward, keeping her chin angled toward the desk. The Alpha King's face was turned slightly toward her, his eyes, usually burning with the frantic, volatile gold of a ruler, pushed to the brink of feral madness, fluttered shut. He did not open them immediately. 1 second passed, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. For a man who had not slept without heavily armed guards stationed at his bedroom door in a decade, closing his eyes in the presence of another living person for 3 seconds longer than a normal blink was a massive concession. He was trusting his absolute blind spot to a low-ranking clerk, anchored entirely by the practical scent of her coarse linen smock and the steady, unspectacular competence of her quiet labor. As the hours stretched on, the fire in the small hearth began to die, the once bright orange flames reducing to a smoldering, bruised red. The temperature in the royal archives dropped in slow, measurable increments, allowing the bitter frost of the northern winter to press harder against the thick stone walls. Neither of them moved to restock the wood. The pile of dry cedar logs sat no more than 3 paces away, yet the thought of pushing back a chair, of crossing the floorboards, and breaking the profound, meticulous quiet that had settled between them felt like a tactical error. Nellie kept her attention anchored to the heavy parchment of the grain reserve ledger. The cold was a familiar pressure. Her thick apron offered a layer of insulation, trapping her body heat beneath the sturdy linen, while projecting its faint, grounding aroma into the freezing air. The chill seeped through her leather shoes, but she ignored it, holding her posture completely rigid. Darius occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. But this particular silence lacked the jagged, feral edge that usually accompanied the sovereign of the northern pack. The frantic, unyielding vigilance that had kept him awake for 5 months was slowly bleeding out into the ambient cold, replaced by the rhythmic scratching of her quill. Nellie reached the bottom of a column, her eyes scanning a misaligned requisition total from the southern storehouses. As she moved her left hand to turn the heavy ledger page, she noticed a small smudge of fresh black ink on the scratched timber near Darius's wrist. It was a minor imperfection, a stray drop from his own heavy pen, pooling darkly against a deep groove in the wood. Without pausing her workflow, not out of subservience, but out of a simple, pragmatic desire for order, Nellie leaned slightly forward. She pulled the edge of her heavy linen sleeve over her knuckles and quietly wiped the ink away before it could seep into the wood grain. The thick fabric absorbed the dark stain instantly. The motion was small. It was entirely ordinary, yet Darius stopped writing. He did not shift his weight, and he did not pull away. He simply watched her hand. Nellie did not look up to meet his gaze, keeping her focus deliberately on the columns of numbers, but she could feel the sheer density of his attention. It was not a predatory focus. It was the still, observing presence of a man who was unaccustomed to anyone daring to clean the space in his immediate orbit without trembling in the process. The scent of crushed pine needles and dried lavender drifted upward from her apron as she settled back into her chair, masking the metallic tang of his exhaustion. They remained like that for a long, immeasurable stretch of time, the dying embers casting elongated, flickering shadows across the high-vaulted ceiling. As the final embers gave way to grey ash, the physical toll of Darius's decade-long reign and his recent, agonizing battle with insomnia began to manifest in undeniable ways. He picked up a secondary document, a logistical report on the Western Border Patrol routes, its red wax seal already cracked and crumbling against the desk. But his movements had lost their characteristic predatory snap. The thick parchment rustled heavily in his grip. He attempted to read the top line aloud, to cross-reference it with Nellie's ledger, but his deep voice, usually a resonant command that could silence a war council, emerged raspy, dragging at the edges. The syllables were slow, weighed down by the crushing gravity of a mind that had refused to shut down for 150 nights. The feral king, the man who had executed treasonous generals without a second thought, was losing a war of attrition against his own biology. Nellie dipped her quill, her spine perfectly straight, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for him to catch his breath. She did not offer pity. Not because she was unfeeling, but because she knew instinctively that pity would shatter the fragile equilibrium of the room and wake the volatile defensive instincts of his wolf. Instead, she waited, her pen hovering over the parchment. Darius let out a low, slow exhalation that ruffled the loose papers on the desk. He lifted his left hand, attempting to steady his failing focus by pressing his fingers against his temple. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability, an admission of a headache so deep it must have felt like cracked bone. But his grip failed. His fingers, calloused from years of wielding iron and issuing mandates, slipped against his own skin, lacking the fine motor control required to maintain the pressure. The heavy muscles in his neck trembled with the effort of holding his head upright, his massive frame betraying the limits of its endurance. His eyelids grew increasingly heavy, fluttering as they fought the overwhelming gravitational pull of rest. The fierce, amber intensity of his gaze was clouded, retreating behind a fog of absolute exhaustion. This was not a surrender he was choosing. It was a physical collapse he could no longer hold back. The oppressive cold of the archive, combined with the steady, repetitive geometry of the grain reserve ledger and the continuous, grounding scent of her lavender-and-pine apron, had systematically dismantled his defenses. Nellie kept her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on the numbers, acutely aware that the Alpha King was unraveling mere inches from her arm. Darius's hand slid down from his temple, resting heavily on the oak surface as his fingers went slack against the very edge of the official ledger. The scratch of the iron-nibbed pen across the parchment was the only sound left in the underground vault. Nellie did not look up from the columns of grain tallies, though she could feel the crackling ozone tension that usually radiated from the sovereign, slowly degrading into something heavy and blunt. He had been holding a requisition manifest for the western border, but the parchment slipped an inch down his thigh, his grip loosening finger by finger. His massive frame, usually locked in a state of coiled readiness, was losing its brutal battle with gravity. She watched him through the periphery of her vision. His chin dipped toward his chest, then jerked upward, a predator's deep-seated instinctual refusal to show weakness. But the relentless exhaustion of 5 sleepless months was a heavier anchor than pride. The space between them at the heavy wooden table felt unnaturally dense, filled with the dying heat of the hearth and the fading adrenaline of a sovereign pushed beyond physical endurance. Then, with a slow, inescapable finality, his posture gave way completely, his head tilted sideways, slipping past the invisible boundary of rank and propriety, and dropped heavily against Nellie's right shoulder. The impact was not a gentle, stylized brush of affection. It was a solid, staggering collision of bone and dense muscle. The sheer physical weight of his skull forced her own shoulder to dip marginally under the pressure, requiring her to immediately engage her core to keep her spine straight. Darius was a large alpha wolf in human form, built for warfare and execution, and in unconsciousness, he felt like a falling block of granite. Immense heat immediately seared through the thick linen of her protective covering. It was a terrifying, suffocating warmth radiating from his skin and sinking straight into her collarbone, anchoring her to the chair. Nellie stopped breathing entirely. Her fingers tightened around the barrel of her pen until her knuckles turned white, the ink pooling in a dark, irreversible blot over the number she had been writing in the current document. She did not gasp. She did not flinch away. In the rigid hierarchy of the Northern Pack, to touch the sovereign without permission was a punishable offense. To act as a physical brace for a feral, unpredictable ruler was a matter of survival. She was supporting the literal center of power of the kingdom, and the certainty lodged itself between her ribs like a sliver of cold glass. He was not a man seeking comfort. He was a collapsing monolith. She waited for the violent jerk of awakening, for the paranoid snarl of a king who had spent a decade anticipating assassination. She waited for his eyes to snap open, for his claws to tear into the desk in a defensive panic. But the violent reaction never came. Instead of snapping awake, the heavy mass, resting against her collarbone, settled deeper, his temple pressing firmly against the curve of her neck. The frantic, shallow rhythm of his respiration, a pattern she had tracked for hours through the quiet scratch of her pen, began to drag. It lengthened, evening out into the slow, rhythmic cadence of genuine, restorative sleep. It was not the light, dangerous doze of a soldier sleeping with one eye open, ready to kill at the drop of a pin. It was a profound physiological surrender. A long, low breath shuddered through his massive chest, vibrating against her right side. Then a soft, rare sigh escaped Darius's lips. It was a sound completely devoid of the sharp command and lethal authority that defined his reign, a quiet exhalation of a man who had finally stopped fighting the dark. The breath stirred the crushed pine needles and dried lavender buds sewn into the pockets of her apron, sending a fresh, grounding wave of herbal scent rising into the cold air between them. It seemed to work as an anchor for his wolf, placating the feral beast that had kept him pacing the halls for months. Nellie finally allowed herself to take a slow, calculated breath. She turned her head, just a millimeter, angling her chin to look down at the man feared across 3 territories. The harsh, permanent scowl that had been carved into his features by endless war, betrayal, and treason was entirely gone. The deep, exhausted grooves bracketed around his mouth had smoothed out into a quiet neutrality. The brutal tension in his jaw, usually locked tight enough to crack bone, hung slack. Without the terrifying weight of his golden, hyper-vigilant stare, and beneath the heavy veil of his dark hair, he looked unexpectedly human. The wild, feral edge of his wolf, the madness that the court whispered about in terrified corners, was completely pacified by the steady, unbothered silence of the archive and the mundane scent of her work clothes. He was asleep. The most dangerous Alpha King in existence was asleep, anchored entirely by the stillness of a low-ranking clerk. Letting that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, Nellie realized the extreme physical consequence of her situation. She could not move her right arm. If she shifted her shoulder to dip her quill, or if she adjusted her posture to ease the crushing weight against her collarbone, the shift in elevation would undoubtedly wake him, waking a sleep-deprived alpha wolf prematurely from his first genuine rest in half a year was not merely foolish. It was a profound risk to the stability of the entire keep. She stared at the open pages, the ink drying on the tip of her pen. Her duty to the archive remained, but her physical mechanics had just been entirely compromised. The safety of the realm currently depended on her serving as an unmoving pillar of stone. The heat of his skin bled through the thick linen of her scented workwear. The crushed herbs woven into the fabric released a steady, grounding fragrance under the sudden warmth of his body, mingling with the sharp ozone scent of his aura. Darius was a massive entity, dense with muscle, and his skull felt like a solid iron weight resting squarely against her right collarbone. His breathing, which had been a harsh, jagged rasp for the past 4 hours, flattened into a slow, rhythmic drawl. Each exhale sent a faint vibration through her shoulder, a tactile confirmation that the sovereign had surrendered to his biological limits. Nellie remained locked in position. She understood the volatile biology of a hyper-vigilant wolf. A sudden flinch, a sharp intake of air, or the scrape of a wooden leg against the cold stone floor would not merely wake him. It would trigger a violent, disoriented defensive strike. The beast beneath his skin would perceive any abrupt shift in equilibrium as an imminent threat. He would wake swinging, destroying whatever stood nearest before his rational mind could catch up. Silence settled in her chest like a stone dropping through still water, slow, thorough, filling every crack. She locked her joints into place, turning her body into a rigid, unyielding support. To maintain the position without collapsing under his weight, the clerk needed a better physical foundation. Her right side was entirely compromised, pinned by the dead weight of the king. Nellie engaged in a deliberate, brutal calculation of physics. She pressed the leather sole of her left boot flat against the freezing flagstones, testing the friction of the stone. Millimeter by agonizing millimeter, she transferred her center of gravity. She rolled her body weight off her right pelvic bone and shifted it entirely onto her left hip. She had to manage the stress on the ancient wooden chair beneath her. The oak joints were old and prone to complaining under uneven pressure. If she tilted too far, the wood would groan. She measured the angle of her spine, holding her breath, adjusting the physical load until she found the exact fulcrum where her posture supported the alpha without straining the furniture. The chair remained quiet. Almost immediately, a deep, burning ache bloomed between her right shoulder blade and her spine. A tiny muscle near her neck spasmed, protesting the unnatural, static lock. The young woman simply let the pain exist, breathing through her nose to keep her chest from rising too sharply. She had spent her entire tenure in the keep, learning how to swallow physical discomfort, how to stand perfectly still in freezing drafts while high-ranking wolves debated her utility. But this strain was different. Not the kind of endurance forced by a humiliating hierarchy, but a deliberate, tactical choice. The most feared sovereign on the continent, a man who commanded the northern territories with absolute ruthlessness, was currently anchored to her shoulder. He was completely unguarded in a room full of shadows. She chose to endure the cramp. She chose to be his foundation. The grain reserve ledger remained open on the scarred desk, its thick, fibrous pages demanding attention. The amber glow of the dying beeswax candle cast long, flickering shadows across the heavy parchment, highlighting the blank columns that still required verification. They were auditing the winter rations for the outer garrisons, sacks of barley, dried venison, and salted fish that meant the difference between survival and starvation for the border patrols. The audit was not complete. If the sleeping man woke to find the work stalled, the fragile piece of the archive might shatter back into his usual relentless drive. Her right arm was entirely immobilized, serving as the load-bearing pillar for his rest. The archivist extended her left hand toward the brass inkwell. The movement felt profoundly clumsy. Her left arm lacked the refined, microscopic muscle memory developed over years of meticulous documentary duty. She hovered her fingers over the cold glass vial, ensuring her knuckles did not graze the metal rim. A single clink of glass would echo like a gunshot in the vaulted room. She pinched the iron-nibbed quill. It felt top-heavy, the balance entirely wrong for her non-dominant grip. With excruciating care, she dipped the tip into the dark liquid, tapping the nib once against the inner glass wall to catch the excess drop. She brought the pen to the massive book. Her first stroke was a disaster. The line staggered across the parchment, the ink pooling slightly at the curve, before she managed to adjust her applied pressure. She gritted her teeth, locking her left wrist and forcing her elbow to do the work of guiding the unfamiliar angles. The scratching sound of the metal nib on the rough paper was louder than usual, lacking her customary smooth glide. She monitored the volume of each stroke, adjusting the angle of the pen to minimize the harsh friction. It was maddeningly slow work. A single line of inventory, which would typically take her 3 seconds to record, now demanded a full minute of concentrated effort. Normally, her handwriting was an impeccable, flowing script, uniform, elegant, and completely devoid of personal flair. Invisible perfection was the ultimate goal of a low-ranking record keeper. Now, the letters formed jagged peaks and uneven valleys. The numbers in the winter supply column tilted awkwardly against the ruled lines. A tally of 50 sacks of wheat looked slightly crushed at the top. A 5 dragged its bottom loop too far below the margin. She did not stop. Cross-referencing the border garrison logistics required turning the supplemental reports stacked to her left. Nellie used the pad of her left thumb against the top sheet, sliding it silently across the wood to expose the figures beneath, then copied the tallies into the main document. The visual contrast on the page was absolute. The top half of the ledger displayed her pristine, right-handed administrative exactness. The bottom half documented a jagged, strained struggle for legibility. It was a physical record of the night. Long after the beeswax candle burned down to a stub, this fresh ink would remain as a permanent, undeniable scar on the official pack archives, proving that for one night the hyper-vigilant Alpha rested, and a quiet woman did not let him fall. As the grandfather clock in the upper corridor struck 2, then 3, the muffled chimes barely penetrated the heavy oak doors of the Royal Archives. Nellie tracked the time through the subtle shifts in the room's temperature and the deepening strain in her body. The hearth fire had long since burned down to a fragile bed of white ash and a few stubborn orange embers, leaving the subterranean vault to the mercy of the northern winter. The cold seeped upward through the foundational stone, biting at the hem of her heavy linen skirts, yet her entire right side burned with a localized, sharp ache. Darius remained entirely motionless against her. The heavy weight of his skull rested squarely on her right shoulder, trapping her dominant arm against the carved wooden armrest of the clerk's chair. For the first hour, the pressure had been a manageable discomfort. By the 3rd hour, the muscle cramp had blossomed into a radiating agony that stitched its way up her neck and burrowed down into the joint of her elbow. Her blood flow was heavily restricted, leaving her fingertips cold and prickling, with thousands of invisible needles. She did not attempt to adjust her posture. Nellie had spent years observing the elite guard from the shadows of the archive, noting the frantic, paranoid geometry of the king's stance whenever a door opened too quickly or a chair scraped the floor. His wolf was a coiled spring of defensive violence, sharpened into a lethal edge by 5 uninterrupted months of insomnia. If she shifted her weight to relieve the ache, if a sudden movement woke him abruptly, the transition from deep sleep to waking reality would likely bypass his rational mind and trigger a feral defense mechanism. The archive would be destroyed. She would not survive the instinctual reaction. So she absorbed the physical toll into the quiet architecture of her own endurance. To distract herself from the agonizing fire in her shoulder, Nellie used her left hand to slowly slide a stack of old administrative journals toward her across the broad timber surface. Her fingers were clumsy on the unfamiliar side, but she managed to ease open the heavy, brass-bound cover of a decade-old registry without making a single sound. The parchment was stiff with age and neglect. It was a logbook from the first brutal year of his reign. She read the entries in the dim, flickering candlelight, her eyes scanning the meticulous lists of military deployments, executed traitors, and border casualties. The records painted a grim, isolated picture. There were no entries of council feasts, no mating ceremonies, no royal celebrations. There was only the systematic consolidation of a fractured pack by a deeply isolated young king. The ledger documented how he had inherited a poisoned court, forced by treason to execute the very elders who had once trained him in the combat rings. The brutal reality of the dried ink stripped away any lingering intimidation she felt toward the massive man sleeping against her collarbone. He was not a monster by biological nature. He was a survivor of a political system that demanded absolute ruthlessness, a ruler who had traded his own psychological peace to secure the borders. His breathing remained deep, and even the faint, sharp scent of ozone and winter frost, mingling perfectly with the crushed pine needles and dried lavender buds sewn into the deep pockets of her apron. The familiar garment was doing its exact job, anchoring his hyper-vigilant senses to a quiet domestic reality that demanded nothing from him. By the 4th hour, the acute pain in her shoulder had settled into a dull, heavy numbness. Nellie carefully pushed the historical journal aside, letting her left hand rest briefly on the cold wood to regain feeling, before pulling the massive, leather-bound grain reserve ledger back into the center of the candlelight. The kingdom's winter survival depended entirely on these logistical numbers, and she had a professional duty to finish the audit tonight, even if she had to do it completely left-handed. She reached for her glass inkwell, but realized the angle was impossible. Reaching across her own body to dip the pen would inevitably shift her collarbone and disturb Darius's temple. Instead, she slid her left hand toward a small, battered wooden box on the edge of the desk, extracting a thick stick of drawing charcoal usually reserved for mapping out new border terrain. Holding the charcoal awkwardly between her left thumb and index finger, Nellie began to cross-reference the requisition orders against the actual stockpile counts from the western border. At first, the discrepancy seemed like nothing more than simple clerical errors. A missing sack of winter barley here, a miscounted barrel of salted venison there, but as she forced her clumsy hand to trace the delivery routes with the blunt tip of the charcoal, a highly deliberate mathematical geometry began to take shape on the page. She held her breath, flattening her lungs to keep her chest perfectly still beneath the king's sleeping form, and leaned closer to the parchment to inspect the ink strokes. The missing supplies were not random, and they were not lost to the winter storms. They were being systematically diverted from 3 specific border outposts all operating under the direct jurisdiction of Captain Garrett Thorn. The requisition forms bore the official patrol stamp, but the delivery signatures at the bottom of the pages were subtly altered. The loop on the letter was too sharp, lacking the natural curve of a man signing his own name. The pressure on the quill was far too heavy, digging into the paper in a way that lacked the fluid, practiced stroke of the Royal Quartermaster's usual handwriting. Nellie's heart established a steady, quiet rhythm against her ribs. She dragged the charcoal down the column, drawing small, precise circles around the suspicious dates. Every single time Garrett Thorn's patrol reported a skirmish with rogue wolves, the grain reserves for that specific sector vanished under the administrative classification of spoiled goods. The captain was not just embezzling luxury items. He was systematically starving the outer defenses and selling the surplus grain on the black market, blaming the deliberate shortages on the very rogue attacks he was supposed to prevent. A thin layer of black dust coated her left fingertips as she worked, smudging the edges of the heavy parchment. She mapped the entire treasonous conspiracy in absolute, suffocating silence. There was no sudden gasp of realization, no dramatic intake of air. She simply calculated the exact tonnage of stolen grain, recorded the specific dates in the margins, and drew a hard charcoal line connecting Garrett's patrol routes to the falsified delivery manifests. Without warning, Darius shifted his weight. A low, rumbling exhale vibrated deep within his chest, the sound pressing heavily against her side. Nellie froze instantly. Her left hand hovered completely still over the ledger, the tip of the charcoal suspended a millimeter above the page. She stopped breathing. She waited in the near darkness, consciously forcing her own pulse to slow down, willing the calming, earthy scent of her clothes to reach his shifting senses before his wolf could wake. Slowly, the terrifying tension drained out of his massive frame. He settled deeper into the curve of her neck, his jaw relaxing, his sleep remaining unbroken. Nellie exhaled a controlled breath through her nose and looked back down at the grain reserve ledger. The evidence in front of her was undeniable. She held the physical proof that Captain Garrett Thorn was bleeding the Northern Pack dry from the inside out. Now she only had to wait for the dawn. Sometime later, the iron latch of the outer archive door depressed with a faint, metallic scrape. Silas Croft paused on the threshold, his ink-stained fingers curled tightly around a fresh bundle of requisition forms. The chief archivist had returned, expecting to find the royal audit in shambles. He had fully anticipated the sight of the sovereign pacing the cold stone floor in a sleepless, feral agitation, tearing through the ledger with ruthless impatience, while his junior clerk stayed invisible in the shadows. Instead, Silas found a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against the ancient stone walls. He stepped deeper into the room and froze. There, at the weather-beaten desk illuminated by a single beeswax candle, sat the most dangerous Alpha King in existence. But Darius Vorn was not pacing, and he was not raging. He was unequivocally asleep. His massive head rested heavily against the delicate curve of Nellie's right shoulder. The terrifying hyper-vigilance that had driven the Northern Pack to the edge of terror for a decade was entirely gone. In its place was the slow, steady rise and fall of a man finding genuine rest. Silas stared, struggling to process the impossible sight. Nellie sat rigid beneath the sovereign's immense weight. Her right side was completely immobilized, locked into a posture of absolute stillness, while her left hand continued to trace the columns of the grain reserve ledger with quiet precision. She did not look up immediately. She was entirely focused on managing her own breath, ensuring her inhales did not disrupt the angle of the king's rest. When she shifted her gaze toward the doorway, her eyes met Silas's wide, disbelieving stare. Moving with excruciating slowness, he set his papers on a nearby shelf. He pointed a trembling finger toward a folded woolen blanket resting on a stool in the corner, then gestured toward Darius's head. He was offering a practical substitution, a way to slide a makeshift pillow beneath the sovereign so she could finally free her cramped, burning muscles. Nellie did not hesitate. She gave a sharp, minuscule shake of her head. The movement was barely a perceptible degree, but it was a categorical refusal. She knew the truth of his precarious condition. The slightest shift in the angle of support could be disastrous. A millimeter of change in the texture beneath his cheek, or the sudden loss of the familiar scent of her botanical shield, would snap his feral wolf violently awake. He would wake defensive and deeply dangerous. Silas read the strict command in her eyes. He nodded slowly, his shoulders dropping in, silent surrender to her calculated judgment. Backing away into the shadows of the threshold, he crossed his arms over his chest and planted his heavy boots firmly against the stone, taking up a quiet, unblinking guard position. If she was willing to endure the physical torment of bearing the king's weight, the least Silas could do was ensure no one interrupted them. The fragile peace held for another hour, suspended in the amber glow of the dying candle, until a new vibration disturbed the deep quiet of the underground vault. It began not as a sound, but as a subtle tremor traveling through the cold stone floor. Nellie felt it in the soles of her boots first. The sensation was dull but persistent, a steady mechanical pulse that did not belong in the restricted administrative wing. Slowly, the vibration morphed into an audible noise echoing down the long corridor. It was the heavy iron-shod thud of marching boots. Nellie stopped writing. Her left hand hovered over the open parchment of the supply record. She listened to the cadence of the approaching steps, her mind rapidly calculating the threat. This was not the measured tread of the Royal Night Guard. The rhythm was too fast, too aggressive, and completely disorganized. It was an unauthorized unit moving with desperate purpose, actively searching the lower levels of the keep long after the official curfew. The heavy footsteps grew louder, bouncing harshly against the cold stone walls. Structural vibrations shook loose a fine layer of dust from the ceiling timbers, sending grey motes drifting down through the candlelight. The noise was invasive, sharp enough to penetrate the thick wooden doors of the archive. If the patrol struck the door, or if their shouting breached the room, Darius would be torn from his rest. He would wake not as a rational king, but as a cornered predator, his defensive instincts overriding any logical thought. Nellie's immediate reaction was entirely protective, rooted in physical mechanics rather than panic. She pressed her left hand flat against the surface of the scarred wooden desk, spreading her fingers wide to grip the splintered edge. She locked her elbow and braced her upper body, turning her own spine into a rigid shock absorber. As the vibrations traveled through the stone floor and up her chair, she absorbed the kinetic energy into her own bones, refusing to let the trembling transfer to her right shoulder. Her muscles screamed in protest, burning with the accumulated exhaustion of hours spent as a human pillar. A dull ache radiated up her neck. Yet she did not flinch. She leaned slightly closer into the sovereign, closing the microscopic gap between them. She allowed the thick warmth of her lavender-and-pine apron to envelope his senses completely. She breathed deeply, forcing the calming scent of crushed pine needles to act as a dense olfactory shield against the impending danger outside. The disorganized patrol reached the end of the corridor. The iron-shod boots halted abruptly, just outside the heavy oak doors of the archive. The silence that followed was heavy with the unspoken threat of violence. Nellie kept her hand firmly planted on the desk, her knuckles turning white against the dark wood. She held her breath, staring at the cold iron latch, waiting to see if it would turn. The sudden halt of heavy boots outside the vault did not startle Darius into the blind panic Nellie had been dreading. For the past decade, the court whispered that any sudden noise, a dropped goblet, a slammed door, a shout in the courtyard, had been enough to snap his fragile consciousness into a violent, defensive frenzy. She braced herself for his feral wolf to demand blood before his human mind could even assess the threat. But this time, the transition from deep, restorative slumber to absolute wakefulness was remarkably smooth, almost imperceptible. He did not jump. He did not snarl. He simply opened his eyes. The dim amber light of the dying hearth reflected in his irises, as he remained perfectly still against her shoulder. The fire had burned down to mere ash and white-hot coals, offering little resistance against the bitter winter draught seeping beneath the thick wooden barriers. From her cramped vantage point, Nellie could see that his mind was entirely clear, his gaze stripped of the exhausting static that had haunted him for 5 agonizing months. He listened to the erratic, impatient rhythm of the footsteps approaching the outer corridor, his jaw set in cold, mechanical precision as he calculated the distance and the intruder's intent. Then his gaze shifted slightly, dropping to her frozen form. Nellie sat entirely immobilized on her right side, her neck bowed at a painful, unnatural angle to accommodate the broad line of his jaw and the heavy drape of his winter cloak. The knuckles of her left hand were stark white, still gripping the quill pen above a stack of newly corrected logistical records. She was barely breathing, taking shallow, measured intakes of air that smelled faintly of the crushed pine needles infused into the fabric of her clothing. She felt his attention settle over her like rain seeping into dry soil, slow, absolute, filling every hollow space. He seemed to recognize immediately that she had held this rigid, agonizing posture for hours, sacrificing her own physical comfort and risking severe bodily strain, just to protect the fragile peace he had finally found. She had adapted her entire methodology, learning to cross-reference the manifest and tally the numerical columns using only her left hand, all to ensure that the necessary work of the kingdom continued without disturbing him. She had not panicked when the most dangerous Alpha King in existence had collapsed against her. Instead, she had frozen herself in place, turning her own body into a silent, living shield against his madness. The heavy footfalls outside paused near the archway, followed by the metallic click of a sword hilt scraping against iron hinges. Her breath finally caught, a tiny, involuntary reflex of apprehension. The king did not look toward the door. He kept his attention entirely on the severe tension vibrating through the muscles of her jaw and the stiff line of her collarbone. The feral beast that usually clawed at the inside of his ribs seemed entirely silent, placated by the scent of lavender and the profound realization that this low-ranking clerk had given him the one thing his generals could never secure: safety. Slowly, deliberately, Darius lifted his heavy head from her shoulder. The sudden absence of his weight caused the clerk's spine to jerk, her overworked muscles spasming sharply in protest, vibrating like a plucked bowstring under her skin. A quiet, sharp intake of air hissed through Nellie's teeth as she instinctively tried to lower her right arm, only to find it entirely locked. The joint was stiff, the blood flow restricted after hours of bearing the heavy burden of his rest. She kept her eyes focused on the ink-stained ledger in front of her, refusing to show the depth of her physical distress, maintaining that careful flattening of pain that had defined her invisible survival in the keep. He watched her struggle for a fraction of a second before he moved. He did not issue a command. He did not offer a meaningless apology. Darius Vorn occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. He reached out with his right hand and closed his large, calloused palm over the curve of her numb shoulder. Nellie flinched slightly at the unexpected contact, but he did not pull away. His grip was remarkably measured, applying a firm, steady pressure that immediately began to coax the stagnant blood back into her frozen tissues. He used the flat pads of his fingers to massage the stiff cords of her neck and the locked joint of her rotator cuff. His dangerous claws, the same claws that the court whispered had torn through iron chains and rebel armor, were meticulously retracted, ensuring they did not snag or tear the rough linen of her apron. The heat radiating from his palm was absolute, sinking through the heavy fabric of her work clothes and into the deep ache of her bones. He worked the cramp out of her shoulder with the methodical, patient expertise of a warrior who understood exactly how muscles failed and how they recovered. It was an act of raw, unvarnished gratitude, a physical acknowledgement of the debt he owed her. For the quiet archivist, the sensation was entirely disorienting. The sovereign was not supposed to perform physical labor for a subordinate. He was not supposed to notice the quiet suffering of someone so far beneath his station, let alone take active steps to alleviate it without being asked. In the rigid hierarchy of the court, an Omega was meant to absorb the pain of her superiors without complaint. Yet, as his thumb pressed firmly into a knot near her collarbone, forcing the tension to finally release, she realized that this was not an act of dominance. It was an act of profound, equalizing respect. The pain in her arm began to recede, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth that had nothing to do with the dying embers in the hearth. They were no longer just a king and a servant trapped in a subterranean vault. They were two silent survivors, bound by the quiet, undeniable truth of the night they had just shared. That fragile peace, shattered moments later. The heavy iron hinges of the outermost archive doors shrieked in protest, the sound tearing through the quiet, underground vault. Captain Garrett Thorn stepped across the threshold, his heavy winter patrol boots leaving wet, muddy tracks across the stone. The military captain wore his fur-lined cloak pulled tight, melting snow dripping from his polished silver epaulettes. Behind him, the restless shifting of two subordinate guards echoed in the narrow stairwell. The men brought the harsh scent of the outside world into the enclosed space. Frozen ozone, wet wool, and the sharp copper tang of adrenaline. The patrol officer expected to find a trembling clerk easily bullied into handing over the logistics records, or a feral, incoherent ruler too, consumed by sleep madness to understand a forged requisition order. He did not expect to find King Darius standing perfectly still, directly in his path. Nellie remained seated at the aged wooden bureau in the inner chamber, observing the shifting geometry of the room through the narrow opening of the vault door. She did not flinch even as the freezing draft from the corridor swept in, threatening to overwhelm the grounding warmth of her lap. She simply watched as Darius moved. He did not rush or adopt a combat stance. He simply walked toward the threshold, the massive book balanced effortlessly against his side. Garrett stopped mid-step. The aggressive momentum that had carried the captain down the stone stairs evaporated in a single heartbeat. The intruder's eyes darted upward, taking in the undeniable physical reality of the man standing before him. The sovereign was not hunched under the weight of chronic exhaustion. His broad shoulders were relaxed. His breathing was slow, unhurried, and deeply anchored. His amber eyes, usually clouded with unstable paranoia, were entirely clear and devastatingly focused. "My king," Garrett stammered, attempting a rigid military bow. "Forgive the sudden intrusion. We received an emergency administrative directive to secure the logistics records." The lie hung in the cold, damp air, flimsy and desperate. Garrett was banking on the rumor that the sovereign's mind was too fragmented to process administrative discrepancies. But Darius simply stood there, holding the physical proof of the theft, his expression entirely unreadable. He merely looked down at the captain, his gaze possessing the stillness of a compass needle finding absolute north. Nellie watched from the shadows, her breath shallow and controlled. She recognized the exact moment Garrett realized his error. The scent of easy confidence sharply soured into the distinct, bitter tang of cold sweat. He had come to destroy the evidence of his massive embezzlement. Instead, he found a ruler perfectly awake, mentally restored, and holding the exact document that would end his career. Darius shifted his stance by the narrowest margin, positioning his broad frame to entirely block the doorway to the inner vault. The movement was deliberately slow, devoid of aggressive posturing, yet it effectively eclipsed Garrett's line of sight into the room. He shielded Nellie from view, ensuring the intruder could not see the clerk who had spent the night uncovering his fraud. It was a calculated act of defense, not because he believed Nellie was incapable of facing a threat, but because he refused to let the violence of the court contaminate the quiet sanctuary she had maintained for him. He would not allow a traitor to drag his chaos across its threshold. Darius leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them without taking a single step. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the deafening, feral roar the patrols had grown accustomed to fleeing. It was a low, resonant whisper, stripped of all inflection, carrying through the freezing air with the precision of a surgical blade. "An emergency directive," Darius repeated, the quiet words echoing off the damp stone walls. "Organized by whom, Captain?" Garrett's face drained of color, his military discipline collapsing under the quiet interrogation. By the upper command, sire. To ensure the winter grain shipments were accurately charted before the frost deepens. I see. Darius slowly lifted the grain reserve ledger, his thumb tracing the worn edge of the binding. A fascinating precaution, especially since the entries from the past 3 months indicate that 400 bushels of barley were diverted to a private merchant holding in the Southern Valley, a holding registered directly under your brother's name. The silence that followed was absolute, not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. Nellie watched from the safety of her desk, noting the precise mathematical dismantling of the captain's pride. There was no chaotic brawl, no breaking of furniture, no sudden burst of supernatural dominance. The king was using the indisputable weight of administrative truth, weaponizing the very records she had painstakingly organized. "You will surrender your sword, Garrett," Darius whispered, his tone remaining perfectly level, preserving the hushed reverence of the archive. "You will strip yourself of your rank insignia. You will walk to the lower detention cells, and you will wait for the tribunal to formally record your theft." The captain opened his mouth to argue, but the sovereign's amber eyes flared with a brief, sharp warning. It was a promise of immediate, structural ruin if he dared to raise his voice in this sacred space. Garrett slowly unbuckled his sword belt, his hands shaking so badly the leather strap slipped twice before he could release it. The heavy weapon clattered to the stone floor. He reached up, tearing the silver epaulettes from his cloak, the thick fabric ripping in the dead quiet. Without raising his voice, without drawing a single blade, Darius had completely neutralized the highest-ranking patrol officer in the northern quadrant. He watched with cold detachment as Garrett backed away, retreating up the stairs in disgrace, leaving the sanctuary of the archives exactly as peaceful as they had found it. As the intruder's footsteps faded up the stairwell, the pale light of the northern dawn began to creep through the high, narrow windows of the vault, casting sharp shadows across the scattered parchment. The bitter cold pressed against the thick glass, but inside the archive, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The suffocating, feral tension that had followed the sovereign for 5 months was entirely absent. Darius stood by the scarred oak desk, his broad back to the dying embers of the hearth. His focus anchored entirely on the open grain reserve ledger resting under the brass lamp. Nellie remained seated on her wooden stool, her right shoulder aching with a dull heaviness, though the terrifying numbness had finally begun to recede. She watched him quietly, her hands folded over the coarse linen of her lavender-and-pine apron. Darius leaned closer to the massive, leather-bound book. His large, battle-scarred fingers brushed over the surface of the rough paper, tracking the progression of the black ink. He was a man who noticed everything, a sovereign trained to read the smallest disruptions in the geometry of a room. Now, he was reading the physical evidence of her quiet endurance. Halfway down the page, detailing the Western outpost supplies, the handwriting changed abruptly. Her elegant, sweeping strokes gave way to something entirely different. The new letters were jagged, rigid, and uneven. The ink pooled slightly at the edges of the numbers where the quill had hesitated, the lines shaking with obvious physical strain. Darius followed the trembling script with his index finger, tracking the agonizingly slow progress of her left-handed calculations. He did not need to ask what had caused the shift. The timeline was recorded perfectly in the columns. The messy, halting handwriting began at the exact hour his exhaustion had finally broken him, when his heavy skull had dropped against her collarbone. He stood perfectly still, letting that knowledge settle into his chest. She had not panicked. She had not woken him. She had not shifted his weight to relieve her own cramping muscles. Instead, she had frozen her dominant side, accepted the crushing burden of a hyper-vigilant shifter, and taught herself to calculate stolen resources with her offhand. The numbers were ugly, the ink smeared in places, but the mathematics were flawless. Every hidden deficit created by the corrupt patrol was mapped out with brutal administrative precision. Darius closed the heavy ledger, the solid thud of the cover echoing off the cold stone walls. He did not offer a grand declaration of gratitude. His appreciation was entirely intellectual, rooted in the concrete proof of her tactical competence. She had weaponized her own stillness to protect his vulnerability, and she had used a broken, left-handed script to secure his kingdom. That was not weakness. That was a calculated, terrifying level of endurance. He picked up the ledger, his jaw set with a cold, permanent certainty. The era of her invisibility was officially over. By mid-morning, the great council hall was summoned into session. The massive circular chamber smelled of old wood smoke and nervous sweat. The elite of the northern pack stood in tense, murmuring clusters, their fur-lined cloaks brushing against the polished stone floor. They had been called from their beds without explanation, only the absolute command of the crown forcing them to assemble. Nellie stood near the center of the room, her posture straight, her breathing slow and measured. She had not changed her clothes. She still wore her faded grey dress and the heavily stained apron, the scent of crushed herbs mixing strangely with the expensive perfumes of the nobility surrounding her. She felt the heavy weight of their collective stares. The whispers carried confusion and disdain, quiet questions about why a low-ranking clerk was standing inside the witness circle. She did not lower her gaze. She simply watched the dais. Darius sat on the raised iron seat of the sovereign, the grain reserve ledger resting open on a wooden stand beside him. He did not raise his voice to silence the hall. He merely leaned forward, and the entire room oriented toward him the way iron filings orient toward a lodestone. The murmurs died instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and completely under his control. A scribe stepped forward, carrying a freshly prepared parchment on a silver tray. It was a formal crown seal decree. Darius took the heavy vellum in his left hand. He did not address the whispering nobles. Instead, he reached for the thick stick of golden wax resting near a lit candle. He held the wax over the open flame, letting the heat soften the gold until it dripped thick and heavy onto the bottom of the parchment. The traditional iron stamp of the crown lay on the table, waiting to be pressed into the seal. Darius ignored it. Without a flicker of hesitation, he pressed his bare right thumb directly into the scalding, molten wax. A collective intake of breath rippled through the council. It was a visceral, undeniable gesture. An iron stamp could be forged, stolen, or argued in a tribunal. A thumbprint in golden wax was a blood oath, a mark of absolute personal protection that carried the full, terrifying weight of the sovereign's wrath. It meant the decree was not merely a matter of state, but a matter of his own physical domain. Darius lifted his hand, unbothered by the blistering heat, and held out the parchment. The scribe hurried down the steps and presented it to Nellie. She looked down at the document. The elegant, curving calligraphy spelled out her name, permanently altering her classification within the pack registry. She was no longer a shadow in the lower vaults. The Crown Seal Decree formally appointed Nellie Vance to the position of Chief Archivist, granting her direct, uncontested access to the King's private council. It was not a romantic gift designed to win her heart. It was a necessary, structural political move to clean up a rotting system, built entirely on the irrefutable evidence she had extracted with a cramped, shaking left hand. She had proven her intelligence, and he had formalized her power. Nellie carefully folded the parchment, the dried pine needles in her pockets shifting with the movement, and looked up to meet the king's eyes. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate acknowledgement of an equal standing on the battlefield of the court. By midday, Nellie's relocation was already underway. The eastern wing of the keep was a territory previously forbidden to anyone below the rank of a high counselor. The corridor floors were lined with thick, sound-dampening wool runners, and the stone walls retained the heat of the massive central hearths. When Nellie was escorted to her new chamber, a secure, heavy-doored room directly adjacent to the king's private quarters, she found 4 palace servants attempting to maneuver a massive, polished mahogany desk through the archway. The wood gleamed with expensive oil, its surface perfectly smooth, utterly devoid of history or practical use. Nellie stopped in the doorway, her hands resting in the deep pockets of her work dress. She watched the staff struggle with the heavy ornamental legs. Then, without raising her voice, she instructed them to take it back. The head servant blinked, holding a brass handle. He explained that the king had ordered the finest furnishings for the new workspace. The archivist did not argue. She simply stated that the mahogany would reflect too much candlelight and cause eye strain during night audits, and that she required her old furniture from the lower vaults. Silas Croft arrived 20 minutes later, supervising 2 grunting guards as they hauled the scarred, heavy oak desk up the spiral stone stairs. The older man looked entirely out of place in the luxurious royal wing, his fingers stained with black ink and his tunic smelling of dust, but his expression carried a quiet, undeniable satisfaction. He directed the guards to set the battered wood exactly where Nellie pointed, near the hearth, angled so she could see the iron-bound door without turning her head. Once the guards retreated, Silas ran a calloused thumb over a deep groove in the oak. It was the exact groove where the young woman's right elbow always rested during the long winter nights. She had not asked for the old desk out of sentimental attachment. She asked for it because she knew its geography perfectly. She knew which drawer stuck in the damp weather, which corner held the inkwell without slipping, and how the timber absorbed the sound of a scratching quill rather than echoing it across the room. Silas reached into his satchel and withdrew a heavy, rolled parchment. He set it down on the scarred surface. The document bore the heavy, pressed gold wax of the Crown Seal Decree. It was the official record of her promotion, the legal boundary that placed her beyond the reach of the council, the military, and the bitter hierarchy of the pack. She unrolled it slowly, pressing the edges flat. The pristine, cream-colored vellum looked entirely foreign against the ink-stained oak, yet it anchored her new reality with absolute structural finality. She did not smile, nor did she offer her former superior a tearful expression of gratitude. She merely pulled her chair out, tested its familiar weight, and asked if the updated logistics ledgers from the western border had been finalized. Silas gave a dry, raspy chuckle, tapping the edge of the desk twice before turning to leave. He understood. The title had changed, the room was warmer, and the physical threat of cold and starvation had vanished, but the work remained, and the work was exactly what had saved them all. By midnight, the keep had fallen into its customary winter silence. Outside the thick glass windows, the northern wind howled over the parapets, driving a relentless sleet against the stone. Inside the new chamber, the atmosphere was entirely different. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep, steady bed of orange embers, radiating a dry, comfortable heat that settled into the marrow of Nellie's bones. She sat at her desk, her posture straight, her focus narrowed to the rows of figures on the parchment before her. She wore her familiar lavender-and-pine apron over a clean linen dress. She had washed the garment that morning, but the crushed herbs woven into the heavy fabric retained their distinct, grounding scent, now mixing with the sharp, clean aroma of burning cedar logs. She wrote steadily, her right hand still occasionally sending a dull ache up to her shoulder, a lingering reminder of the physical toll she had paid to guard the king's fragile rest 2 nights prior. Whenever the cramp flared, she simply switched the quill to her left hand, maintaining her rhythm without missing a breath. She was not alone. On the thick, woven wool rug positioned between her chair and the hearth, a massive beast lay sleeping. Darius Vorn had shifted into his wolf form shortly after the evening council meeting concluded. The creature was terrifying in scale, a mountain of midnight dark fur, corded muscle, and lethal, bone-crushing power. He took up a vast portion of the floor space, his heavy head resting on his front paws. To the rest of the continent, this beast was a symbol of feral wrath and absolute destruction. To the archivist, he was a steady, rhythmic presence anchoring the room. His breathing was slow, deep, and perfectly even. Every time he exhaled, a soft rush of air ruffled the edges of the rug, the severe, maddening tension that had plagued his body for the past 10 years was entirely gone. He had found his sanctuary, not in an empty vault, but within the sensory radius of her quiet labor. Nellie did not reach down to stroke his thick fur. She did not attempt to treat him like a tamed pet, nor did she presume a level of physical intimacy that had not been spoken aloud. She understood boundaries better than anyone in the fortress. The contract between them was built on mutual respect, measured distance, and the safety of unforced proximity. Instead, she simply adjusted her posture. She shifted her leather shoe, extending her leg just enough so that the side of her foot rested a fraction of an inch away from his dark coat. She did not touch him, but she allowed the ambient, furnace-like heat radiating from his massive body to seep through the leather, warming her ankle. The wolf's ears flicked. He did not wake, nor did he open his eyes. But with a slow, deliberate movement, Darius let out a long, low rumble from deep within his chest and shifted his bulk just enough, so that his thick fur pressed firmly against the side of her foot. He anchored himself against her, claiming that small point of contact with absolute trust. She paused her writing for a single second. She looked down at the fearsome creature, sleeping at her feet, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat, transferring through the floorboards. She let that knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone. Slow, thorough, filling every crack. No one would ever demand she vacate a room again. No one would ever dismiss her labor as invisible. The work would continue, the ledgers would be balanced, and the truth of the pack would be preserved on paper. She dipped her quill back into the inkwell, the scratch of the metal nib resuming its quiet song against the parchment. The long, bitter winter raged against the fortress walls outside, but within the steady, cedar-scented warmth of the chamber, the sovereign and his archivist held the quiet safely together.